Thank you all so much for coming to our fourth session of summer school, Feminists Resisting Fascism. Engelman. I am the engagement manager here at CODEPINK. Through a feminist lens, this series will be tonight, and to be exploring how imperialism, militarism, propaganda, and economic exploitation fuels authoritarian movements, and how collective action and global solidarity can dismantle them. First, I'm going to go over our norms and then pass it over to our amazing, wonderful member and youth coordinator, Jasmine, to start our session. We're going to have a Q&A moderated also by Jasmine at the end, a closeout from our amazing Palestine campaigner, Noor. So please be adding your questions throughout the chat. But I'm norms before we intro. As I said earlier, please intro yourself in the chat, name, location, be respectful. This isn't a debate, but we're not here to mediate arguments. We're here to learn from each other and take action for Palestine, the people, and the planet. Be curious, be kind, be ready to take action. And please, please, I am going to say it multiple times, please stay muted. We record and live stream these classes, so we want everyone now and in the future to enjoy. I'm going to pass it now to Jasmine to moderate our session and introduce our session. And again, another reminder, please stay muted. You can ask your questions or your thoughts in the chat the whole night.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grace. Like she mentioned, my name is Jasmine. I use they pronouns, and I'm on staff here at CodePink, where my entire job is supporting all of our wonderful local organizers, carrying out this work in their communities. And so when we started to plan for summer school, based on the conversations I've been having with lots of our local organizers, I immediately knew that we had to have a session on propaganda. Right? It's all around us. It paints so much of our everyday, right? We often talk about being bombarded with so much media, so much news every single day, right? But the moment you step into anti-imperialist consciousness and anti-imperialist spaces, you begin to see how much of a media bubble we live in, right? We begin to see how much the information we receive as folks in the United States is filtered through a fine mesh sieve in which some people are victims, some people are aggressors, some people can do no wrong, right? And it's really important that we're able to parse through these narratives. So we know, very well here at CodePink and in our communities that disinformation and propaganda are central tools of fascist movements, right? Propaganda can be used by anyone, but in this particular moment, right, there's a lot of propaganda making sure that we fall in line with and on the side of the United States and the United States empire, and that we believe the narratives that are being created about people and about other places around whether or not they deserve to govern themselves, whether or not they deserve to live a life free from constant bombing and warfare, right? And so we recognize that media literacy and critical media analysis are two really, really essential tools to meet the moment. And we really want to give you all some tools for that tonight. But first, I want to define the two as two different things, right? So media literacy, right, on the surface, it's our ability to identify and understand the message of any media we consume. So we know every film, TV show, article, news piece we read has a very direct overt message, right? Can you understand and actually comprehend the message that they are clearly giving, the argument they're making, right? The explicit nature of the message. Yet to go a step further, critical media analysis requires us to actually look at the actors and motivations and biases, as well as the full history of a topic or a place covered in media, so that we can analyze what are the arguments being made, what are the stakes, what are the hidden motives, right? Who wins or benefits, who loses, where are the people, where are the most vulnerable, right? So we both need to understand what media is telling us directly and, what's on the surface, as well as all of those implicit motivations and biases and narrative tools that are working together to shape our collective understanding of global issues. And so again, if you're here in community with us at CodePink, we always want to fall on the side of feminist anti-imperialism, supporting people's peace and self-determination, and pushing for an end to war everywhere. And therefore, today we're so lucky to be talking about media literacy and propaganda with two amazing folks. First, we're joined by Palestinian organizer and popular educator, Layan Fuleihan, who is the education director at the People's Forum. And we're also joined by scholar of Middle East history, Dr. Assal Rad, who is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. And we're so lucky to hear from both of these folks today as they support us in breaking down media complicity teaching us to identify manipulative narratives that justify war and oppression, right? It's all about building our toolkits so that we are more equipped to parse through the news and information that's out there, to understand breaking news, often about countries we don't have much history or information about. But how can we learn? How can we make sure that we're parsing through everything that's out there and landing on the side of the people? So we have two experts who are very well versed in the tactics that media uses to shape our understanding, and we're lucky to be learning from them. So first, I will turn it over to you, Layan.
Well, thank you so much, Jasmine, and the whole CodePink team. It's really wonderful to be with all of you here this evening. I want to start first by just applauding CodePink for the really incredible work that the CodePink community has done, especially over the past 2 years of this unbearable genocide. And, nothing actually makes the day better than by seeing that CodePink is not stopping, that there's no politician that has a moment of rest as long as CodePink is still active and still growing. So it's been really amazing to be, in the movement with all of you for the past couple of years. And I know we're right now, it's not over. We are in a very dire situation. And so I think this meeting, this session, this discussion that we're having about media bias and media narrative, and our approach to how we actually understand the mainstream media, the corporate media, couldn't be at a better moment. I mean, we are right now, I saw a comment from one of the attendees. I'm sorry, the chat went too quickly, so I can't find it to say who put it there, but who entered saying I couldn't believe that we're at this moment, we're in the final stages of famine in Gaza. We are in a horrendous moment in Palestine, on the ground in Palestine, where I don't have to say to this group, I think everyone knows, that basically the U.S. Israeli forces, I call them U.S. Israeli forces because they would not be able to do it without the U.S., are basically gunning down hungry people and starving people until they are killed either by hunger or by bullets. And the mainstream media has nothing to say about it. In fact, the New York Times this morning I got a notification that their main article on Palestine today was that Israel is not managing the power vacuum in Gaza enough. Wall Street Journal says that Israel's chaotic food distribution program is too chaotic. I don't have them in front of me, so I'm not saying exactly what they said, but essentially, they are masking exactly what's happening. These are small articles. They are not on the front page. We should be seeing an ongoing genocide on all media outlets, on the front, on the top, and it should be told accurately. It should be naming the perpetrators, but it doesn't do that. And that's why we're here. So I don't want to spend too much time. I know we only have a short amount of time going over that. What I do want to do is offer a little bit of a framework on how I approach understanding and parsing through the mainstream media and how we can use it as a tool to diagnose and understand better how imperialism is actually working, what its agenda may be, how it's moving, where the cracks are, and where they aren't. And I'll start by just saying that, just very briefly, because again, I do think this group is already up to date on this. The mainstream media, of course, has a bias. The idea of objective journalism is not true. In fact, I don't think we would even stand for it. But the truth is that the mainstream media, it's not objective. It is on the side of the capitalists and those in power. And it shows this bias by what it says, by how it says what it says, and what it doesn't say. And just to very briefly give examples of this, really the genocide has exposed this for so many people, but this is actually nothing new. This is the reality for the mainstream media, and it's in some of the history of the United States and before. What it says, well, after October 7, we actually saw nothing about what the Palestinian people were going through, any deaths on the Palestinian side. If Palestinians were killed, the number was alleged, it was so-called, it was put into question, whereas we heard so many personal first-person narratives from Israeli individuals talking about pain and suffering, but this is classic dehumanization, nothing that would show exactly the inhumanity of what the Palestinian people are going through. Then there's also the question of how it says what it says. An example I like to use for this one is, this is more subtle. When the Israelis carried out the horrific terrorist attack against the Lebanese people, the so-called pager attack, when they exploded thousands of communication devices in the hands or pockets of many different Lebanese people, some who are members of Hezbollah, but others who are also ambulance drivers, firefighters, and anyone else that may use a pager or a walkie-talkie. They said this is an amazing, amazing technological advance. This is such a incredible, stunning attack. This is stunning. Stunning was the word of the day. It was framed as, blowing off the hands and faces of thousands of people in one go was considered to be an incredible innovation. Just the way you would talk about a new iPhone or a new technology. And this was repeated among many different mainstream outlets. I'm sure you all remember that. The same thing happened when the United States bombed nuclear facilities in Iran very recently. The main headlines were a stunning overnight attack, an incredible attack, such precision. Again, talking as in this kind of blasé way about the deaths and the destruction of people and critical infrastructure in a way that makes it sound like it's an advertisement for a new technology. This is really important to take note of. And then, of course, there's what it doesn't say. It doesn't report on the Palestinian side. It doesn't, like I opened with, the story of the genocide and the famine right now are at the bottom of the page. They're not at the top. We have to sort through a whole bunch of stuff about Jeffrey Epstein and a bunch of other things, which are not unimportant, but certainly don't compare to the mass murder of, at this point, hundreds of thousands of people. And we've all witnessed this, and it's kind of driven us all crazy that we can see the same wording, the same omissions, or the same emphasis being used across multiple different media outlets, from the New York Times to Fox News. Although these two outlets oftentimes are considered to be on the opposite ends of the political spectrum, you can actually see many word similarities in wording. Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, these are all different enterprises, but you can see that all of a sudden, none of them said the word genocide for months and months. All of a sudden, they were all allowed to use it again. Then all of a sudden, the famine is on the top headlines. All of a sudden, it's back, no longer anywhere to be found. So we all know that this bias is a bias that favors the White House. We use this phrase that the mainstream media or the capitalist media are not media. They are the stenographers of the imperialists, or they're the stenographers of the White House. How does this actually happen, though? Is it just that the mainstream media is just parroting the White House because everyone has agreed that they want to be imperialists? I would say no, it's much more complicated than that. And that's what we have to know so that we can actually know how to read it and then also know how to use it. Because we are not here just to decry the media. We're here to organize a movement against imperialism that can grow in its efficacy over time. So how does this happen? I'm going to offer a few elements that lead to the feeling and the objective reality that the mainstream media begins to and is basically always parroting the White House main points. One, journalists rely on government sources for information. So that's one thing. So if government sources all want to feed the media a certain line, they're all going to get it. Okay, fine. So for example, during the Iraq War, the New York Times was all over before the Iraq War talking about how Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, which of course was not true. Everyone knew was not true. But the New York Times was echoing George Bush's insistence that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and their claim is that they're getting this from White House sources, and so it wasn't their fault. Okay, that's one thing. There's another element here, and we're seeing this play out very dramatically under Trump, is that media does not get a seat in the White House press briefing room unless they are allowed to be there by the White House. Trump has actually started handpicking which journalists are allowed to be there. Even Fox News is upset about this. So media that starts to challenge the White House narrative might find themselves eventually losing a seat, which means they're not going to get the exclusive story, which means they're not going to be able to sell the news as well as their competitors. Again, this media is not here for social justice. They're here to make money. These are capitalist media outlets. So in the end, they want to sell. There's another element that I think is important, is that a lot of main journalists or spokespeople or executives or pundits that you see on TV, many of them had roles either in or around the White House. And when they retire, they go into the media. So maybe they've worked for AIPAC before. Maybe they've worked for the Council of Foreign Affairs. Maybe they've worked for another kind of White House adjacent think tank. But the world of kind of elitist careers can be blurred sometimes. A lot of journalists have served spent much of their time of their career working for the CIA or other intelligence outlets. So that's why it's also really important to always look at who is writing the article. Because they don't often hide this. They put it on as part of their credentials, so you can clearly see their track record. Then, of course, as I've said already, the mainstream media wants to sell. So, of course, they're going to be influenced by money. I don't need to say this. I think Code Pink has taught us all the role of AIPAC and the Israel lobby on policymakers, but also on the media. Just the way that you can lobby policymakers, and the way you lobby is by wielding wealth. You can do that with business executives and media outlet owners. They can do this to either pressure media outlets to fire unruly journalists. Mark Lamont Hill, for example, was very publicly fired because of his position on Palestine. Or they can put pressure to say, avoid terms like, don't say the word apartheid. You could say something else. Don't say the word genocide. Don't say the word ethnic cleansing. You could say war. You can say conflict. Don't use certain vocabulary. There's also been stories of the White House directly pressuring media outlets not to use certain words or to emphasize or de-emphasize certain things. And then, of course, there's documented cases of collusion that go back decades. Very famously, during the Cold War, the CIA infiltrated the media in very large numbers. It seems that hundreds of journalists were actually working for the CIA. This was so that they could create an echo chamber. This was a period in time in which the United States was so invested in making sure that no pro-communist ideology ever made it out. It never made it into the consciousness of people. They had the Soviet Union right there showing people that even with very little wealth, they could provide free healthcare and daycare and jobs for everyone and literacy campaigns. And now you have the wealthiest country in the world that isn't doing so bad, but isn't getting so many services like a communist country, socialist country. So the US was going on overtime to make sure that everyone demonized pro-socialist or pro-communist ideas. And so they infiltrated the media and also to help create this echo chamber. So when you see certain lines repeating, of course, that's not always an operation. That can happen from any of the other elements that I've just listed, but I don't think that's off the table either. In terms of what's happening in Palestine, we have another added element. There's the fact that Israel has banned reporters from going into Gaza. The only way that any reporter has been able to go into Gaza has been through embedding with the IDF, which means that they have the point of view of the occupation. I don't think someone who embeds with the occupation is necessarily going to be criticizing them when they're with them. Then I don't have to say this, but Israel has been assassinating Palestinian journalists who are already on the ground from the beginning. Hundreds of Palestinian journalists have been killed, and then turning off the internet, making it impossible for the news to get out, banning Al Jazeera from operating anywhere in the occupied Palestinian territories. This is part of the genocide, is also making sure that the voices, the narratives of the Palestinian people don't get out. I think all of these elements create a situation in which it's not that the media is necessarily parroting the White House in one big centralized conspiracy, but it's in a system in which when you uphold the status quo, you get benefits. You can keep your job, you can be promoted, you can make more money, you don't have to deal with certain headaches. It's just like the system that we live in now, where policymakers don't listen to their constituents. They listen to the wills and desires of capital because the system prioritizes and gives benefits to those who actually uphold the status quo, where capital is dominant over the voices of the people. Excuse me. So what does that mean for us? Because that's all fine and dandy. We already know the mainstream media does not represent our views, not on Palestine, not on white supremacy, not on any other issue. So what do we do about it? Well, I am, sometimes it seems it can be called a hot take, but I am someone who reads the mainstream media every day. And I do encourage people to do that because it's important to know what they're saying. It's important to know what they're not saying. It's important to know what they're saying and how they're saying it, because we want to know what the imperialists in power are prioritizing and emphasizing every week. So I'm not an advocate for just turning off the news. I think it's important that we do know those who we're fighting against, what they are doing, what they're saying. But I would say that it's important that we never only just read the mainstream media. We have this great thing called Google Translate. Now there's ChatGPT, DeepSeek, your AI website of choice. We can translate media outlets from across the world, whatever the issue is, whether it's about Palestine or about another issue. If we can't get a US or an English-based media that is giving us an in-detail approach, we can find a media outlet in another country, in another language, where we can also learn. But most importantly, excuse me for my cough. Most importantly, I think the most important thing for us to do is never to think about media consumption and forming our opinions as something that we do in isolation. The thing that has turned the tables for Palestine over the past 2 years has not been that we've had a great alternative media that has just challenged all the mainstream media. It's been that the movement has become the reference for truth. When Biden went out on national television and said, Israel did not bomb that hospital, it was too late because the entire movement had already informed everybody that Israel, in fact, did bomb that hospital with US bombs. And so his attempt to recreate the narrative immediately failed. It had failed before it even had begun. What's happened is everyone who's in this room has been part of building a movement that's now been the new reference for truth. So it's our task to help people parse through the mainstream media, engage them on it, show them the way the wordplay works, show them what's missing, show them the reality. We can actually see it thanks to technology. We know what's happening in Gaza more or less. We can listen to Palestinian voices. We can listen to left or alternative media that's going to help us explain it, but we shouldn't do it alone. The point is that our opinions, our insights, our perspectives should always come from a collective process that's part of a movement that's growing in offense to imperialism. I know I'm over time, so I'll end there with saying that really our bias is that we actually want to create a new world where the oppressed and the colonized and the marginalized and the exploited are the ones actually in power. The majority of the human people in the world are the ones who are in power. We're the ones who actually can run society in a way that for the well-being of all. That's our bias. The mainstream media's bias is going to be to uphold the interests of capital and war. But we are going to do our own media and our own media reading in a way that upholds the bias of the majority of people across the world. So I'll end there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Layan. I learn so much every time we hear you speak. And I think highlighting particularly those elements that show that there are so many ways and reasons and motivations behind why the media moves the way that they do. And also the reminder that, like, if we want to stay on the same page with the masses, with the people, and see the narratives that they are internalizing so that we can improve our own messaging and our own ability to reach people, then yes, we do also need to know, how is the media talking about Palestine 2 years into this genocide, right? What is the average person who doesn't know to look to movement media understand about what's happening, and how can we meet that moment. I think that's amazing. And yes, as a reminder to folks, we will be ending with the Q&A. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Assal Rad. But in the meantime, please do drop your questions in the chat.
Well, thank you for having me be part of this conversation as well. And I don't want to repeat something that's already been presented so well and so well articulated when we're trying to understand the way that the media operates. I'll try to keep my comments limited so we can get into the Q&A, and that'll probably give us more opportunity to have a discussion. What I'll try to add just a little bit to the contours of that conversation that Layan already outlined for us is one of the things that I think is important to understand when we talk about the media, when we talk about censorship and propaganda, is what's interesting about it is how subtly it actually works. Because if you live in the West, you live in this concept of liberal democracies. And one of the cornerstones of liberal democracy is the idea of a free press. Now, why is a free press so important? Why do we always talk about a free press? Why do we have, White House correspondents' dinners where we toast the free press every year? Because the only way to hold governments accountable, in a democratic system, the entire point is that it's a government of, by, and for the people. What does that mean? That means that they do not dictate to us, right? The government is not supposed to dictate to its people what policy should be. It's supposed to be the other way around. Of course, it doesn't operate that way. We all know that. It's not operating that way at all. But that's why the press is so important. What they're supposed to do is challenge the state. The difference between a free press, when you juxtapose it with, say, an authoritarian press or an authoritarian state, what states in Europe and the United States will argue is, well, they just repeat, they're limited, they're censored in what they can say in an authoritarian state. You're not allowed to challenge the state. You're not allowed to tell the truth, even if the state is violating international law, suppressing their own people, repressing speech. The media is not allowed to say that, and that's what makes it state-sanctioned media. We've even seen this manifest on social media. If you guys remember, where there was, Twitter started adding labels, state-affiliated media, to, if it was Russian media, if it was Iranian media. But of course, US media is not state-affiliated. We're free. We're free press. And that's why it's so important. It's important that it's free because it's supposed to challenge what the government says. The governments lie. That's one thing we can all agree on. Governments across the world lie. So what is the point of a journalist, a reporter? They're supposed to get at the truth. They're not supposed to tell you, Israel says this and the Palestinians say this. They're supposed to tell you what happened. And yet we repeatedly see Israel says as the framing for a story. That's not their job. Their job is to tell you what happened, not to tell you what a state that is committing genocide is telling you is happening. And so that's the difference that we're trying to tease out. And the reason I say it's subtle is because there are a lot of great investigative pieces. You will see a New York Times piece that'll say, hey, Israel, well, they won't say Israel lied because they're not going to use that language, but they'll say, new video casts doubt on Israel's narrative of 15 paramedics that were massacred,
what happened?
buried in a mass grave, and along with their crushed ambulances. Sorry, I was catching myself for 1 second. It won't say that, right? They won't say Israel lied, but they will tell you the story. So this creates the illusion of a free press. Because now you think, but we have these great investigative pieces. They are calling it out. They are saying Amnesty International accused Israel of genocide. It's the subtlety that I think is something that is really important to get to. And that's one of the things that I've tried to do is correct headlines. It's a little hobby that I have where I take a headline, I cross out the words I think don't make sense or are not telling the truth in red, and then I add a word here or there, for instance, the word Israel, when something is happening and Israel's responsible for it, but for some reason it's not in the headline. And people have asked me, why do you do this? Why do you focus on headlines? And why is this an important exercise? I don't know that it's necessarily an important exercise. I just did it and it seems to have resonated. But my reasoning behind it has been the subtlety. The fact that I can take a red pen and with switching around a few words, the entire framing and meaning of that headline is suddenly different. What you take from it has suddenly changed because the subtlety of that difference is how they try to get away with saying, of course, this isn't propaganda. This is a free press. The information is there. They're reporting, often they're reporting what is happening, but it's the way that they're reporting it, is the word choices of how they're reporting it that's important. One example I'll give is the compartmentalization of the Palestinian issue. The fact that Gaza is treated separately than the West Bank, is treated separately than East Jerusalem, is treated separately than the right of return question in the Palestinian diaspora, when in fact, all of those territories, all of those issues are part of one Palestinian national identity and liberation movement. And there's an intentional reason behind separating it out. For instance, when I see a headline that says Gazans, I'll cross it out and I'll write Palestinians. And people have asked, well, Gazans is not incorrect. They are Palestinians from Gaza and therefore Gazans. And I say, that's fine. I understand. I'm not saying that Gazan is not a unique sub-identity within the larger banner of Palestinian national identity. But the compartmentalization is intentional. And if you don't know, which most of the public doesn't know, unless you've studied these things, unless you're very interested and you've read about these things, then you don't necessarily know that a Gazan is in fact also a Palestinian. And by compartmentalizing it and separating it out, they try to make them separate issues so that we're not talking about Palestinian liberation. So that when a genocide is happening in Gaza, you don't think about the fact that annexation is happening in the West Bank and all of it is interconnected, because as long as Israel can use, the boogeyman words like Hamas or Iran-backed or Houthi rebels to scare people and to describe everything that is in opposition, in fact, to an occupation that Israel has carried out for decades, then people will not connect these dots. And so those are the things that I would look for when we're trying when we're entering this landscape of mainstream media. And I agree, we can't avoid mainstream media. I also get a comment oftentimes that says, nobody reads this. Why do you care about what they're saying? Nobody's reading nobody watches CNN. I wish that were true, but it's not. Because while there's been a significant shift in public opinion vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, and that is important, and that is because of the work, number one, of Palestinian journalists, and number two, of social media and the ability of people to get this information without the filter of, the Western media lens. It's not just the media. The media is parroting our political discourse. So it starts with our political discourse. Our news media copies it rather than challenging it, and then it goes down into, it manifests within our popular culture as well. It is an entire ecosystem that is informing the way that people think, and it's doing it passively. And that's actually when propaganda is the most pernicious. When it's in your face, you don't know, you notice it and you can skirt around it. But when it's everywhere, when you're sitting at a cafe and a CNN ticker is playing in the background and you see bold words that are giving you a headline, when people are not clicking on the headlines, but they're just reading the post as they're, passively scrolling through social media, those words start to enter our consciousness. And that's why they're so important. And that's why the mainstream media, despite the fact that maybe this audience knows not to trust it for its face value, it is still very much influential in the way that people think. Because while the opinions have shifted, it's still mind-blowing to me that this many people still think it's okay for Israel to be committing genocide, still think it's okay to starve children. That is happening because these institutions are still impacting the way that people think. They are ideologically fit to serve the government's narratives, not just our government, but oddly enough, a foreign government, the government of Israel. So those are the things I thought would be good to highlight within this conversation. And then I'm happy to move on to questions from everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think that reminder about the actual role of journalism, like I want to plaster it everywhere in front of the Dallas Morning News and the New York Times and everywhere, because absolutely so much of what they've done is shifted our expectation of their responsibility as journalists and of the government's responsibility, right? The government has no responsibility to stop a genocide that it is funding, right? The government has no responsibility to, abandon Israel because Israel has a right to defend itself, right? So often what mainstream media is doing is shifting the entire national conversation, right? So it is really important to remind ourselves and each other about the actual role and responsibility, so we can see every single time journalists are failing in their responsibility to the people, in favor of instead being government puppets. And especially how often the United States loves to throw around that accusation, right? And as we start to get into questions and particularly specific examples of places like Palestine, but also like China and Cuba and Vietnam and Venezuela, where we see these very similar narratives. But most common, the one I really just, wanted to mention is one of the most common things that is said about places like China and Cuba is that they have no press freedom, is that their media is government run, right? It's almost ridiculous hearing American, press outlets say that when everything that is put in American news is almost always also run by the government, right? So I think you both have really, really given us some poignant reminders about how to view what the media is doing as not neutral, despite how much they nail it over your head in journalism school. It's not neutral, right? Everyone has biases. I love the way Layan put it, that oftentimes mainstream media, their bias is towards empire and upholding it, right? But our bias as the people is towards the people. And so both of you already kind of started by offering some, but just again, if either of you have seen either a recent headline or a specific narrative in the media that you'd like to just call attention to or highlight that particularly shapes how we view and understand imperialism in the US. So yeah, have there been any other headlines that have caught your attention recently, or common media tools? You've both already named out a couple, such as like the passive voice, but are there any others you'd like to highlight?
I feel this is your wheelhouse, Assal. You're so good at this. I always follow your tweets because it is really great to see those horrible headlines rewritten. I mean, I think there's every day there's a new set of headlines. The one that I thought was so incredible after this doesn't have to do with Palestine, but after Zohran Mamdani was elected in the primaries, Wall Street Journal had like 12 headlines a day comparing him to Trump. It was amazing. I was like, what are you trying to get people to think? But I think one of the things that I've noticed that I think is important to talk about in this group is that there have been moments where the mainstream media has suddenly broken its silence on Palestine in a way. Not in any like victorious way for us or for the Palestinian people, but in a way that's in contrast to their general policy of silence going forward. So when they started using the word ethnic cleansing or apartheid in a few different moments, but it never goes beyond criticizing Netanyahu. It never actually what Assal said, it was really important that it doesn't actually talk about the Palestinian issue as a united issue. And when they criticize Israel, they never really go beyond criticizing individual people in government in Israel. And I think that's really pernicious because it masks the fact that this is an ongoing occupation that's been in place for almost 100 years, that is at this point basically subsidized by the United States. It wasn't always true. It used to be subsidized by France. But when the US felt it would be strategic for them, they took over and would not be able to exist without US money or political cover. But instead, all the criticism that has made it through to the mainstream media has been on Netanyahu, which has led some of us who are trying to analyze the media to think, well, maybe the United States would like Netanyahu to be switched out for someone else. But that's all speculation. It masks for the readers or the watchers or the viewers what the root cause of the problem is. So I would just offer that.
I would add to that and a specific example, for instance, is the West Bank, right? So in the West Bank, often when the media and politicians, remember, they're echoing the politicians, when there is actual criticism of settlers, like settler violence in the West Bank. I have seen, and this is not like a compliment to Israeli media necessarily. Israeli media upholds, their own empire in the same way that American media upholds ours. But at least in Haaretz, I have seen phrases, language that I do not see in Western media, like Jewish terrorism. Jewish terror, when have you seen that in the New York Times? But that is what is happening in the West Bank. Pogroms, to refer to what is happening in the West Bank. The difference in the way that it's framed is, even when they're criticizing this, like what they call settler violence, is it's described as settler violence, like it's this fringe, these are just this one random group that does this. The settlers are there because it's Israeli policy. The settlers are protected by the Israeli military. Everything about it is institutional. So, but it's not Israel that is doing is allowing or facilitating this violence. It's settler violence. And that's how something like sanctions against individual settlers is how liberal democratic Biden administration gets away with saying, see, we're soft on Israel. We, targeted sanctions against 4 people that are in the West Bank when those 4 people are in the West Bank because Israel allows them to be there, because the Israeli military protects them. So there's that. In terms of headlines, I'll just give you one very brief example that's recent. I mean, there's so many really, really, really bad ones. The New York Times, to me, just takes the cake on all of this. One older example that the New York Times had that I was like, what are you guys doing when you write these sentences? Why are you not embarrassed to publish this? Was when we reached the 30,000 death toll in Gaza. It was 30,000 lives ended in Gaza was the headline. 30,000 lives ended. I've never heard that. They don't even use language that people use. Like, this is not how people talk. No one says lives are ended. They say people have been killed or died. That's how we talk. But for some reason, that's how they did it. But recently, the starvation in Gaza. Number one, there's barely any coverage. There's barely any coverage. I see my entire timeline is starving children, elderly people, adults, men, women, children in Gaza. Just endless starvation is all I see on my timeline. There is barely any coverage. So first, there's the fact that stuff gets underreported. When it's really bad, they try not to report it because how are they going to report it? The few headlines that exist, Israel is erased. It's not there. There is a food crisis in Gaza. There's a hunger crisis in Gaza. There's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. These are food crisis was my favorite one. I'm like, there's no food crisis. The food is at the border. There's no crisis of food. The food is right there. The crisis is the fact that Israel refuses to allow the food in because it's deliberate policy, it's starvation, and it's genocide. And that's why they don't want to cover it. If they had to tell you every single day that Israel's deliberately starving these people and then killing them when they try to get food every single day, it's an admission of genocide. Because one of the main points, one of the main arguments for genocide that human rights organizations have used is Israel's deliberate weaponization of aid. So if they were to tell you every single day this is what they're doing, they would also have to say, well, I guess Israel is committing genocide. We have no way of denying it. So those headlines that completely erase Israel's responsibility for the starvation in Gaza right now, which is the main issue that Palestinians are dealing with in Gaza, I think is the most egregious that we've seen recently.
Yeah, absolutely. And on this note of responsibility, right? So often what we're seeing the media do is to shift responsibility, hide responsibility, make sure that it is not clear the actors and the motivations happening. So, in the spirit of solidarity, so much of what we're talking about not only applies to how media covers Palestine, but also how it shapes narratives on places such as Iran, Iraq, Syria, right? And so a big part of that is hiding responsibility, hiding the long view of history, right? Even for Ukraine, for example, right? CODEPINK often gets a lot of flack for our stance on Ukraine, but all we're simply asking folks is to take a long view of history, right? Not just looking at the immediate invasion, but actually the years of NATO aggression, right? All the years of what the US has been doing. Similar situation with Iran, Iraq, Syria, right? The United States has some of the most deadly sanctions ever conceived on Syria, right? And yet anything that happens, it's all about individual independent aggressors, right? Acting as if there is no long-standing US intervention. So I'd love to hear from either of you about kind of what commonalities exist in the way that the propaganda machine portrays some of the other places where the US is actively acting as aggressors, and what does this do for our concept of like how warfare continues, and like what is the US doing globally, right? It's constantly throwing stones and hiding its hand, but how do these media narratives about many countries contribute to like this overall cultural imperialism?
Would you like to start or? Well, or either way.
No, it's entirely up to you. That's because I just spoke, I was saying.
Okay. I'll start, but you definitely please. I'll be very quick. I mean, I think the main commonality is that the United States uses the narrative around the people that they are waging military occupation on or invading or aggressing, tries to do what they can to promote the US actions as moral and legitimate, and any resistance to US war and occupation as terrorism, immoral, barbaric. I think we can see this even from before Vietnam. in the early days of the US in its history as a nation state. We see this from before the US existed. The way British and French and German and Belgium would talk about their colonized subjects. The point is to dehumanize people in order to mask the fact that, in fact, what the resistance is actually doing is expressing something that actually people in the US would find in common. They want their own self-determination, sovereignty. They want to be able to send their kids to school without fearing whether or not they're going to come back home in one piece or not. Nobody wants to live under conditions of war and occupation. And that's something that everyday people in the United States will have in common with the people across the world. So the United States creates a mask, a moral mask, by creating a narrative, a dehumanizing narrative, one that masks the real causes also of the conflict. I've been returning a lot to the Iraq War because I was young when this happened. I was not that young, so I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't have the ability to really read critically and understand what all the different players were saying. When really everyone knew that there was no weapons of mass destruction. But I remember in school that everyone and their mother was talking about weapons of mass destruction, and young children were saying that the US was getting invaded. The kind of hysteria that the media whipped up made it so that people felt okay about the massive bombing of Baghdad and other places in Iraq. We could see it with Syria, both in 10 years ago and just a few months ago, the way the United States talked about what was going on in Syria. The New York Times sat down with Jalani after, he has a bounty on his head for he's supposedly this like worldwide wanted terrorist, but suddenly the New York Times has a sit down with him, and they talk about, for the first 3 paragraphs, talk about how handsome he is. There's a way in which they will mask the root causes of suffering, conflict, and occupation in any situation in order to make it seem that their intervention is benevolent. I think we'll talk about that more as the evening goes on. I'm being a little bit vague, but I do feel like the room knows what I'm talking about and actually may have more examples that they could share in the chat and in other places.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, you're talking about the language of imperialism, right? The language of colonialism. And that language never ended. We're still seeing the world engage in that exact same language, and we just pretend like, I always hated I mean, I understand it within the academic world, like post-colonial periods, but I was like, colonialism never really ended. Imperialism never really ended. So we don't really exist in a post-whatever world. But that language of savagery, for instance, like look how many times you've heard of Palestinians being referred to, Palestinian resistance being referred to as barbarism. And they'll make the argument, well, they're referring to Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and therefore that's what they're referring to. But in reality, Palestinians have no recourse. No matter what, I mean, every time I hear that, I wonder, I'm like, okay, well, Hamas came into existence in 1987. What about the decades of occupation before then? What about the establishment of the state of Israel? There was no Hamas. So there's always this way of making, and it's not just the US, it's US and US adversaries versus US adversaries. So US and US allies are always benevolent, and US adversaries are always bad, period. I can give you a few examples that are concrete. Look at, first of all, we have something that's very interesting. In the last 3 years, in the last 2 or 3 years, what we've been able to see is 2 global events, one with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the other with Israel's genocide in Gaza. And simultaneously, we've seen the selective application of international law. At the same time, in real time, you had Biden officials condemning Russia for attacking a hospital and pretending Israel didn't attack every hospital in Gaza. This was happening at the same time. It's part of the reason why this facade is starting to fall apart, because people are seeing it at the exact same time occurring. So you have that example. Why? Because Russia is a US adversary and Israel is a US ally, period. Let's go back to last month. Israel attacks unprovoked Iran, a sovereign country. It's attacked. A country that has no nuclear weapons is a signatory to the NPT, has international oversight of its nuclear program. Israel is a nuclear armed state that won't admit that it has nuclear weapons. Israel attacks Iran because Iran is a nuclear threat to nuclear armed Israel. This is the logic that we have to somehow digest and believe. Now, how does the media and the political discourse pick up on the fact that Iran retaliates against Israel's attacks? Iran is condemned. Iran is the state that's condemned. I thought self-defense was a thing because we hear all the time that Israel has the right to self-defense. Have you ever heard the phrase, ever in your entire life, by any official or anyone anywhere, Iran has the right to self-defense? Palestine has the right to self-defense. Syria has the right to self-defense. Lebanon has the right to self-defense. It's not a right if it's exclusive. That's not a right. That's hegemony. When only one, and it's not self-defense when you're the one attacking. So how do they like justify these ideas? It's because it's in that same language, right? Iran is evil inherently. And so no matter what Iran does, even when they're abiding by international agreements, they're still the bad guys. And Israel's committing genocide, but it's benevolent because it's Israel. So they're the good guys. So it's not the actions that are being judged. It's the actors that are being judged. And when you're this cartoonish caricatures, right? When you basically it's, this very reductive binary, then that's how they get away with doing it, because it just doesn't matter what the person is doing. You vilified and dehumanized an entire group of people so much, the entire Arab and Muslim world so much, that as soon as you introduce their names or their countries, they're automatically bad, and Israel can do essentially whatever it wants. And that's the language and the ideological thinking that justified slavery, that justified manifest destiny. All of that history, we're still seeing it play out in just, a new iteration.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up. I'm pulling from the audience question and kind of a lot of what I've seen, but I think what you just said, the fact that a lot of what media is doing is evaluating the actors and not the actions is huge, right? And so folks are asking the question of, for those of us who consider ourselves on the left, right? Or for those of us who consider ourselves politically engaged, propaganda is still everywhere, right? So how do we actually, any final advice y'all have for remaining critical, maintaining a critical perspective, no matter who the media is coming from, right? We also know that as much as we have some great movement media, the point isn't to turn off our brains once we've decided that we trust the outlet or the writer, right? It's important to always engage critically because there are many outlets who may be great on Palestine, but terrible on Iran or Syria, right? So just any final advice you all have about remaining critical with the media you consume, tools for meeting the moment in terms of media coming from anyone, and how to always, land on the side of the people when you're trying to evaluate a conflict in the news.
Maybe I'll jump in again. So I think that's a really good question. And just on that last point, you can't just sit back and say, well, this media outlet is great on one thing, so it's going to be good on everything else. For example, Al Jazeera is a great example. They've done some really good reporting on what's happening in Palestine. They've been very combative towards the US and Israeli narrative, in fact, giving us tools and talking points in a way to combat and exposing at times the US media and Israeli media on this. But their coverage of Iran isn't always the same, for example, for a variety of different reasons. So you have to kind of continuously always have a critical eye. We always have to read the media thinking, who benefits from this narrative? I want to find the media where the people that I'm fighting for are actually being centered in that narrative. And that doesn't mean, again, not reading the media. We do have to read the media. In fact, many of the best organizers, best activists are the ones who read the media every single day and know exactly what it's saying. Why is that? Well, those of us who are in the movement and have our alternative media sources and we know how to call out the New York Times as bullshit, and it's become somewhat second nature to us. I should mention there's an entire national organization now basically formed for this, Writers Against the War on Gaza, that has been doing incredible work. I mean, it's so cool to see how much people have really taken on the battle of ideas as a serious task. But like was said before, there's so many people who don't yet have those sources. They don't have, that's not part of their life yet. They turn on the TV and they have the television media on. That's what they're getting. They are getting CNN, they are getting BBC, they're getting Fox News, they're getting Good Morning America, CBS, MSNBC. This is where they're getting their media from. We have to be the people who aren't just going and attacking them because they have the wrong ideas, but people who are able to walk them through in a way that helps people feel agency and not attacked, why it is that the media is telling them something that is wrong. Nobody wants to accept that they've been fooled. It's a hard thing to swallow. So the way I recommend that we do it is that we actually prepare ourselves with whatever facts we need, with whatever sources we need to be able to help people show our work. We don't just tell them Fox News is bad or CNN is bad and you should believe me, not CNN. That's not the most effective way, but to actually have proof for it. And we could do that. That's part of what we've been developing here as a movement. I'm just seeing the chat that I don't believe that most people want to stay ignorant. I actually don't think that people want to be lied. They don't want to be lied to. People do want the truth. People do want a different reality. The question is, how can we reach more and more people? The mainstream media has the advantage because they have all the tools. They do have hegemony. They have all of the main television channels. They have the main radio channels. They have the newspapers that can deliver to your doorstep every day. But I don't think that people want to be lied to. When people realize that they're being lied to, either through personal experience or through conversation or interaction with the movement, people accept that and are grateful for it. It's hard work. It's sometimes thankless work, but I actually think that the movement has been doing that incredibly well over the past 2 years. The shift in public opinion would not have happened without those careful conversations that do require a lot of patience. But once people see the operation at play here with the mainstream media, you can't unsee it. And so it really can change people's lives for the better on Palestine and on every other issue.
I'll just add that I love the point of don't do it by attacking, because and the interesting thing is I think sometimes, first of all, what we're doing right now, this is the work. This is it. Like everyone who's sitting here, who's taking the time to have this conversation, to listen to each other, it's incredibly important work. And sometimes it feels like, I'll anecdotally tell you about myself. When I first started correcting headlines, I just thought I was doing it as like an exercise, like an intellectual exercise. And look, if I did this, see how it's different. And it picked up. People started to listen to it. And I sometimes feel like, because it's so frustrating to watch horrors unfold in front of you and feel like you keep saying it and you keep saying it and you keep saying it and nothing happens. It's incredibly heavy and it's incredibly frustrating. And so I think everyone who's here right now understands that kind of frustration when you're doing the work and you feel like, what's the point of the work I'm doing? It doesn't seem like anything is changing. It's not moving the needle. But it's the realization that the needle doesn't move all of a sudden. It moves slowly over time. And this is the work that has to be done. So our choice is either we surrender to it, we surrender to this immoral decay that we exist in, or we keep fighting for something better. And to me, that's by attacking each other. I think we attack each other a lot too. You know, people who like tend to actually agree on most things, but then they'll say one thing that somebody doesn't agree with, and all of a sudden it's like they're out. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, we are on mostly the same page. Like, we have to have space for disagreement, but also space for discussion with people who are on the other side of the fence, who don't agree with us. And I don't think you can move people by attacking them. I don't think we can move people. I mean, look what the Democrats do. They basically have this elitist attitude of everybody is stupid but us. Clearly, this is not a good election tactic to keep doing it. So I think it's really important that we engage in these conversations and that we have this community that keeps reminding each other, and a support system that keeps reminding ourselves there is a purpose behind what we're doing. There are people who are listening. There are people who are being affected, and we will be most effective when we try to have empathy even for people that we don't agree with.
Such amazing reminders. Thank you so much, both of you, as always, for educating our community so deeply and giving us these real tools to walk away with, as we are all every day trying to parse through this media machine. So I'll hand it over to Noor to close us out.
Thank you. And thank you, Layan, Dr. Rad, and Jasmine for such an amazing discussion. And of course, thank you, Grace, for being the best host and putting all the links everybody needs in the chat. I know that's a lot to keep up with, but now more than ever, we do need to equip ourselves with the tools to recognize propaganda and misinformation being used to dilute and erase our work. And we need to equip ourselves with the tools to dismantle these campaigns and uplift our message for Palestine, the people, and the planet. Because as we heard tonight, there's so many reasons why this is core to the work that we're doing and core to our movement. So thank you all for joining, and thank you to all those who sent in questions during this amazing session. I feel like I learned so much, and I learned so much even from just like looking at the chat and seeing what you all are asking. So it's always appreciated, always welcome here. And we can't wait to see you guys for our 5th summer school session on August 4th at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So 2 weeks from now, same time. We're going to have our special guests, Daniel Haifeng and Carl Zha, to discuss authoritarianism and suppression of the opposition. So RSVP for that if you haven't already. And, bring a friend, bring 2 friends. Bring as many friends that you can fit in the room that you're using to join the Zoom call. And then one more thing, if you all want to join our CODEPINK cohort, we've been joining the People's Forum Summer School session with Layan, actually, who's the education director there. So that happens bi-weekly. If you just can't get enough knowledge and education, definitely join that as well, because there's so much to learn, so much to know. And as you guys saw tonight, so much that Layan has to offer. So thank you all for joining. We're a few minutes over time, so thank you all for being patient and staying till the end. And I hope everybody has a good night. Class dismissed.
Thank you. You're the best.